Chapter 12. Olaf's exasperation had settled on him, as it were, at the first sight of his newly returned son. He had accustomed himself to think of Eirik as though he were already half a saint, and utterly unlooked for, his son came strolling toward him across the fields at home, ridiculously tricked out with a stinking black he-goat as companion. And then came the thought of all the difficulties which Eirik's fickleness would bring in its train. A settlement with these barefoot friars he must have too. According to their rule, he thought they could not accept any endowment from the men who sought admission to their fraternity. So all that they had received when Eirik went to the convent had been given as alms. Olaf could not demand its return. But if they tried to claim anything of what he had promised them, when Eirik became a monk, then... Olaf was now angry with the whole crew of them. First, they had strengthened Eirik in his purpose as much as they could, and then, if indeed he could place any reliance on what Eirik himself said, they had supported him again when he began to have scruples and to doubt his calling to the monastic life. But there was something worse than this. It was Eirik's determination to forsake the world which had induced Jorund Reaper to come forward with his suit. It was impossible to doubt that. And in spite of all, Olaf was not so sure, not even after his last journey to Gunnarsby, that Cecilia's happiness was fully assured among the Ripungs. If, then, they were justified in thinking that her kinsman had not dealt quite honestly by them. Olaf said something of this to Eirik one day. He saw that it made his son unhappy. "But it is not unheard of," replied Eirik meekly, "for a novice to be found unfitted to live according to the rule." Olaf made no reply to this. What Eirik said was true, but then most of those who entered the cloister became monks and nuns in due time, and Eirik had been so zealous when he took the habit last year, and he had formed his determination to become a monk without persuasion or pressure from anyone. "'Tis not either sure that I shall ever marry," he then said. "Is it not? Do you think then to take up your old evil courses again?" said his father. Eirik turned red as fire, but he answered calmly and mildly. "But you, father, you have lived as becomes a Christian man in all these years since our mother died, although you have neither married again nor taken to yourself a leman." "I?" exclaimed Olaf, revolted. "I was a man well on in years, and not even in my youth was I known in the stews or in the haunts of dices." Still Eirik spoke composedly. "I promised Father Einar, when I parted from him, that I would keep myself from dicing and overmuch drinking. Will you not believe, Father, that I have learnt something good and profitable in this year I have dwelt under St. Franciscus's roof, and prayed every day in the presence of God himself, in the mystery of his holiest sanctuary?" "Ah, well," muttered Olaf, somewhat ashamed. "Time will show, Eirik, how long you hold to these resolutions." "You should not say such things." Eirik sprang up and went out. But it seemed only to increase Olaf's irritation that Eirik, to all appearance, had now turned pious and meek. He never allowed himself to be goaded into an angry answer. He neither boasted nor told fabulous stories. His father kept him so strictly now that Eirik owned nothing he could call his own. Olaf himself had always been a generous giver of alms, but none of his gifts to the poor and sick were allowed to pass through Eirik's hands. But Eirik devised a means. He rendered many charitable services to his housemates and to folk who passed through, showing thereby his humility and goodwill. That, too, was a vexation to his father, and it vexed him every time he noticed that Eirik withdrew himself apart, went down among the rocks by the waterside into one of the outhouses to say his prayers alone. He told his beads daily and said the little hours of Our Lady, most of which he now knew. By degrees, Olaf discovered that Eirik had set up little crosses here and there on the outskirts of the manor, in the places he frequented for saying his prayers. In the course of the autumn, a rumour came to Olaf's ears that Eirik Olafsson had forsaken his convent because he felt a call to a yet stricter life of penitence. It was said to be his intention to build himself a cell in the churchyard and become an anchorite. The like had never been known in the parish before, so there was great talk among the folk. Some made a mock of it, but others thought it must be a great blessing to the countryside. At last Olaf guessed that in one way or another Eirik himself must have originated these rumours, and so he took his son to task. Eirik was thrown into dire confusion, and it was the first time since his return from the convent that his father had seen him falter and blink his eyes. But his answer was that he had never said he himself would turn anchorite. He had only spoken of something that had been read aloud in the refectory last winter, a book that was called Vitae Patrum. One day Eirik came to Olaf and asked if he might bring the eldest of the Rundmere children to Hestviken. The boy had become a cripple after an illness at the age of 7. When they laid him on the ground outside in summer, he could just push himself about a little with his arms. He scarcely had the power of speech either. Before his sickness he had been a lively, handsome child. He bore no resemblance either to Liv or to Anki, but to a young, merry, red-haired and brown-eyed housecarl who had been at Hestviken the winter before those two were married. But that did not detract from Anki's paternal pride, and even now, when the boy was in this state, both Anki and Liv said they would rather lose all their children than this one. But although they loved him so, and although they always received such abundant doles from Hestviken that they ought not to have suffered want, the sick child was covered with sores and lice, and likely to rot away in his own uncleanliness. His parents did not neglect him. They stuffed him with the best morsels, but they could not cope with the filth. Olaf did not see how he could say no to Eirik's request, for the child was his godson and called Olaf after him. So he merely said that Eirik was not to bring him into the house until he could rid him of his lice and keep his sores so clean that they did not stink too foully. Eirik then kept Olaf Leifson in the barn until the cold set in, but then they had to let him lie in the living room. By this time Eirik had got him tolerably clean, and the boy had learnt to swing himself along a few steps with a pair of crutches. In the course of the winter he acquired sense enough to be able to perform a little light work, such as soaking withies and deer sinews, or planing rough wooden implements. He also learnt to speak better, but he was still a stammerer and tongue-tied. However, there were many drawbacks to having him in the house. Not that the housefolk were ever unfriendly with him, and if once in a while Olav Audunsson took notice of his godson, it was always in the way of kindness. So far as that went, Olaf was not displeased that the poor creature was now looked after like a Christian child. But when he was vexed at the trouble the sick boy caused them, Eirik was made to feel his father's ill humour. As yet Olaf knew nothing of how the folks at Gunnarsby had taken the news that the son of Hestviken had returned. But he was prey to misgivings whenever he thought of it, and it was never long absent from his mind. In late autumn Olaf found time to make a journey to Oslo, and while there he visited the Minorite convent. But he soon saw that he would be told nothing there of the reason for Eirik's defection. It was clear that the friars reckoned this as one of the convent's domestic affairs, and the silence of the cloister was as a wall. They had nothing but good to say of Eirik. They had grown devotedly attached to their young brother, but since it had been made clear both to himself and to them that God desired to lead this soul by other paths than that of the monastic life, then— "Was it after the beating he gave that peasant at Veit that you were clear about this?" He had heard of this through Klaus Wiepart. A pious widow at one of the farms of Veit had sent word to the convent that she would give them some homespun cloth and victuals. Brother Stefan was to fetch the gifts and took Brother Eirik with him. He was to help carry them home. But when they were ready to leave, each with his load on his back, the widow's only son came home, and he had less love for the beggar monks than his mother, so he covered the two friars with abuse, till Brother Eirik could command himself no longer, flung down his sack, sprang upon the peasant, and dealt him a blow on the jaw that felled him to the ground. True, Brother Stefan had remonstrated with him on the spot, and Eirik had humbled himself before the peasant. At home in the convent, too, he had doubtless had to do penance. The barefoot friars would be ill-served by a revival of the memories of their former combativeness. But the incident was talked of far and wide. So Olav had thought to hit the mark with this. But the guardian never winced. "No," said he, "they could not send away a novice on account of a false step of that kind, if he showed true repentance of his sin." Eirik had made no attempt to excuse his hot temper, but had submitted to his penance in such a way that he might be called a pattern of obedience. Eirik's father smiled incredulously. Then at last the guardian told him. Eirik had come hither because he believed himself to be a priest. But since there was a hindrance to this— "A hindrance?" Olav turned suddenly red in the face. "Who has said, father, that there was any hindrance?" "Such is the commandment of Holy Church, Olav. No man who has a blemish on body or limbs may serve before the altar. So, with his maimed hand, Eirik cannot." Olav said nothing. He had forgotten that Eirik lacked two joints of the little finger of his left hand. His first thought had been of Eirik's birth. The guardian resumed, and now he spoke rapidly and with full assurance. Eirik had sought admittance to their order because he believed that God had called him to be a priest. But since God never gives a man a call which he cannot follow, it was clear that Eirik Olafsson had been mistaken in this. But that placed the matter at once on a different footing. During the remainder of his year of probation, Eirik had striven to ascertain whether he were chosen to serve God in the cloister as a lay brother. But in the end, they had all been certain that it was not so. With that, Olav had to be satisfied. The brethren said nothing of the gifts they had received when Eirik came to them, but on the other hand, they were silent as to what had been promised them later. So these questions were never broached. But Olav Audunsson parted from the Minorites in but indifferent kindness, and after that time he always spoke of these friars with ill will. And since in all else he was known to be a pious man, and one so well disposed to cloister folk and priests that not even Sire Halbjorn Erlingsson had been able to quarrel with him, folk deemed that he must have just cause to complain of the barefoot friar's conduct in this matter. It was true that the first thing to shake Eirik's determination was the knowledge that he could not be ordained priest. He had thrown himself into the new life with such burning zeal that the master of the novices, Brother Einar, had rather to restrain him. Many of the monks were wont to stay behind in church after matins in order to pray until prime. Eirik forthwith asked leave to do this every morning, and Brother Einar had to order him back to the dormitory and lie down again. Eirik himself thought he needed no more sleep than a bird on the bough. Were he never so tired when called to matins, the first breath of the cool air of the summer night which met him as he came into the cloister garth was enough to make him wide awake. To enter the cold dark church was almost as it had felt when, as a child, he plunged into the sea for a swim. During matins the lofty vaulted building grew lighter and lighter. At midsummer the first rays of the morning sun swept clear over the hills behind Acre as the brethren left the choir and crossed the green courtyard to return to their dormitory. But 2 mornings in the week he was given leave to stay behind in church after matins. As he knelt in prayer, the images in the choir windows became clearer. The colours began to shine. Then the sun fired the glass, and the reds and yellows glowed and sparkled, till the whole choir was filled with unearthly light and warmth from the many-coloured sunbeams, which splashed the paintings on the walls and the altar cross and the candlesticks with flecks of blue and violet and gold. When the brethren returned to say prime, every corner of the church was filled with sunshine and reflected sunshine, and then came the sound of footsteps in the nave, echoing in the vault, as folk came in to hear Mass. Every time he was to join in the singing, he felt the same surge of joy. He looked forward every day to singing during Mass. He looked forward to Sundays and feast days, for then they sang the hours as well. He looked forward to all Masses for the dead, for then he joined in singing the vigil the evening before. He had always rejoiced in his own beautiful voice. Now he thought of how he was turning this precious gift into account, and in holy awe he set himself to learn to use it in singing God's praises. He was then reminded of a verse, one of the first he had learnt in this house. "My heart has uttered a good word. I speak of the things which I have made touching the king." Eirik often chose the whole of the psalm, which opens with these words, as a theme for reflection when he was allowed to stay behind in the church. He did not yet know it word for word, but there were riches enough in what he had learnt. The first image that had presented itself to him when he gave himself over to prayer, when his Christianity appeared to him as an upper chamber full of locked chests which he had never thought of unlocking, remained with him. Every day new keys were placed in his hands, and he saw that a man's life in this world is never long enough to permit him to lay his hands on more than a tiny fragment of the treasures that lie hidden in the secret stores of the faith. One day a book on paradise had been read out in the refectory. Eirik recalled this chapter next morning as he knelt in the choir and thought upon Gethsemane. He saw paradise before his eyes, a garden like their own, where the hard fruit now clustered thickly on the trees, while potherbs teemed upon the rich mould of the beds, and the flowers were beginning to blossom along the walls. Thus had God planted and sown it for a possession for the first human pair. One tree alone he had forbidden them to touch, but that made them ready to believe the serpent when he tempted them, and said this tree was the most excellent of all, and immediately they fell to plundering it. It was this garden that God gave to the race of man as an earnest. But in Gethsemane the lean and dried-up branches of the olives straggled in the moonlight. In the convent they had some branches of olive trees that had been brought from the castle where their father, St. Franciscus, was born. They were coarse and ugly, with hard and shrivelled leaves. Thus had men planted their garden, to receive God in it when he came down to visit them and redeem them from sin. Among these bitter, withered bushes he had lain upon his face, sweating blood as he saw at the bottom of the chalice all the evil that the race of Adam and Eve had committed and shall commit from the dawn of the ages until the day of judgment. All the blood that had been spilt, all the robbery and murder and false swearing and deceit and lewdness and betrayal were in the chalice, and all this he was now to take upon himself and atone for. And over by the gate lay his disciples asleep, but on the path from the castle Judas is already at hand, leading the servants of the high priest and the soldiers of Pilate with torches and with swords and staves to bind and smite and slay God. There was no one else in the church that morning. Eirik crept forward on his knees to the tabernacle, loosed his clothes, and let them fall to his waist. Then he took the knotted rope, which he wore as a girdle, and scourged himself with it, till it was red with blood. During the day he was sent out into the garden to weed. The sun was broiling hot. At first his back did not feel very sore, but by degrees, as he lay crawling among the beds and the coarse frock grew fast to the raw flesh, was torn away again and rubbed the wounds, and the sun beat straight down upon him, it was like a burning fire across his shoulder blades. But the pain filled him with a deep and humble bliss, for he thought it must feel almost like this, to have a cross resting on one's back. And then he felt his own unworthiness, and it made him so humble that he could have cast himself down with his face in the mould. For the first time he began rightly to understand the meaning of all penitential exercises and all self-discipline, that such things were not an end, but the means. The body required to be chastened and taught obedience, as one trains a horse, and he had a glimpse of the paths that are open to the soul as it makes itself master of the flesh. But when he spoke to Father Einar of this in his next confession, his master said seriously that these were matters in which a newcomer might easily go astray, and he ordered the novice not to impose discipline on himself another time, except after consultation with him. The whole forenoon until dinner-time they were at work in the cloisters, all those of the brethren who were at home. Only the church and the east wing, the chapter house and the scriptorium, were yet built of stone, with a paved colonnade outside. To the west and south of the garth stood timber houses, with a cloister walk of timber. In the stone cloisters sat those brethren who read or wrote, but outside the south wing old brother Arnstein Antonius had his loom, and there stood brother Sigvard and brother Johannes at their lathe and bench. In these forenoon hours brother Eirik had his place beside brother Hubert, an old German monk who had been an inmate of this house since its foundation. He was to teach the novice book law and Latin, and for the sake of quiet they sat in the inmost corner of the cloister, close beside the church door. There was only one other young brother in the convent that summer, brother Arn, but he had been there since his 7th year, when his father, brother Sveinki, had taken the habit. The mother with 2 daughters had entered the nunnery of Gimsoy, and the elder of these sisters had already died, at the age of 18, in odour of sanctity. Brother Arn was but 17 years old, but already an accomplished clerk, so Eirik had to take his lessons alone, and he showed such aptitude that both his teacher and the master of the novices were astonished. And then there came a day when Eirik again had filled the tablet, and his writing was so fair and firm on the green wax that brother Hubert had to show it to some of the others before it was all smoothed out again. A great pity, is it, that brother Eirik should bear such blemish that he cannot be made a priest. This was the first cloud of weeping that passed across Eirik's bright summer sky. He had been so small when he lost that finger that he had never felt the want of it, and it had never crossed his mind that it might debar him from the service of the altar. The novice master remarked that the young man took it deeply to heart. So he spoke to him about it, bidding him bear in mind that it was a far greater aid towards perfection to suffer patiently the trials that were laid upon him than if he himself sought out never so many afflictions of his own devising. And there was just as great need of his being a good clerk if he was to be a lay brother. Their father, St. Franciscus, had never wished to be other than a layman, and in the beginning he had intended to found his order as a company wholly of lay brothers. Eirik listened meekly to the novice master's speech and never spoke of the matter again. But for long after he was in deep dejection. And then autumn came on. There was no more to be done in the garden. The pea straw lay tangled on the grey, frost-gripped beds, and the fallen leaves under the fruit trees were whitened with rime. The monks had long ago taken to their little lanterns when they went to matins in the church. Quitting the scrap of warmth that was to be found under the thin coverlets of his couch, he had to pass through the cold dormitory and down into the cloister, where the raw frost fog stung his nose and crept icily up his naked calves. Thick as wool the wintry mist lay upon the convent. As soon as one entered it, it seemed to force its way in and dim the little lantern. But inside the church it was colder than cold. Eirik was so cold that he thought his brain froze to a lump inside his skull. He did not grasp a word of the prayers he said during the office, for he was too cold to be able to think of their meaning. The fog forced its way even into the church. The candles by the choir stalls shone in a mist, and the friar's breath poured from their mouths like white smoke. But the nave was lost in utter darkness. He now shuddered at the thought of the mornings when he had leave to stay behind after matins for private prayer. Stiff with cold, he knelt with his eyes firmly fixed on the little lamp which shone before the tabernacle. Behind him he felt the body of the church, dark and empty, with the tombstones in the floor. Just outside the choir arch lay Sigrid Undset, and Eirik could not rid himself of the thought, what if the dead priest should appear to him one morning? If he were to turn around now and see Sigrid Undset standing behind him with the blood pouring down from his shattered skull over his pale bony face, the chasuble in which he had been laid, all besprinkled with blood. Now and again he heard a low murmur from one or other of the brethren who had stayed behind as he had. But for the most part they knelt in perfect silence. They had led this life year after year, winter and summer, and now neither the marvellous glory of the summer mornings nor the dismal horror of the winter nights seemed to move them any longer. He tried to keep a hold on himself with all his thoughts centred on the tabernacle. But even that mystery now inspired him with terror rather than consolation. That God had suffered himself to be imprisoned in that little painted tower of wood, and was there. Wide awake in bodily substance, spirit and soul, he filled the church, looked into his own sinful heart, and saw his drooping courage, saw all that stirred in the hearts of all, and in the omnipotence of his Godhead watched over the whole of this wintry land, filling every space. The icy convent, and the town, and the fjord, and the homesteads along the frozen shores, and Hestviken, Rundmere, Knungahella, all the places he could think of. In summer, when he knelt here, and felt the full sweetness of being able to speak with God so near, it had been joy upon joy to know that from the bodily presence of God in the sacrament, he went out in his invisible presence wherever he might be. In the sunshine which filled the cloisters outside, baked the soil of the garden so that the young shoots expanded from morn to eve, poured down through the foliage, while the town fjord and the islands outside and the woodlands round about lay wrapped in heat haze. But now that winter had the world in its clutch, there was nothing but desolation, as though he divined the mighty soundless struggle between Christ and Satan, life and death at grips. All things of sight and sense became lifeless trifles rocking to and fro amid the furious encounter. He would not ask to be released from these hours of watching, to keep which he himself had begged leave. But as time went on, Brother Einar remarked that Eirik no longer had any profit of them, and so he bade the young man go back to bed after matins each morning for a while. But Eirik found it hard to fall asleep again. He could not get any warmth on his narrow couch, with only one sack of straw under him and 2 thin blankets. Another effect of the cold was that he was late in falling asleep at night, so that he was always tired and short of sleep. And often what kept him awake in the morning was simply his dread of having to get up again for prime. And if by chance he got a little warmth in bed, the chilblains on his fingers and toes began to itch and burn intolerably. He himself was in despair over his lack of spirit and tried to summon up courage. Had he not been through much that was far harder and without caring a scrap? He tried to think of rides in storm and driving snow, when at times he had scarce been able to see his horse's head. Or in a boat in winter-time. That night last year, just after he had come home, when they sailed to Tunsberg and a storm sprang up. Right ahead of them, in the darkness, was a loud booming amid the howl and roar of the stormy night. The white wall that seemed alive there must be the Hangman's Reef, and they were drifting straight onto it. With every wave that lifted their boat high into the air, he thought the breakers came nearer. Everything on them had been sheeted with ice when at last, late in the morning, they were able to slip into shelter somewhere a long way to the south. He had thought that Knut, one of Ragnar's sons, would not come through with his life. And had he now grown so soft that he whimpered at the itching of his chilblains? He who more than once had ripped the boots from his frozen feet, who had been used to feel the sea salt bite into the raw flesh of his hands. But such hardships were part of the day's work, and one took them as they came. And afterwards, if life were not in danger, there was the sweet delight of coming under a roof, thawing out one's frozen carcass, eating and drinking one's fill, creeping in under the skin coverlets somewhere or other, 2 or 3 men in a bed to keep each other warm, and sleeping like a log. And there was always a raciness in it. One never knew how things would turn out, or what the next day might bring. But here it was a choice made for one's whole life. After each summer's warmth and joy of heart, one was faced by the winter, and one had to shiver one's way through it, watching, praying, fasting, from Holy Cross Day to Easter, so stiff with cold that neither the hours of rest on the hard bed nor the brief warmth of the refectory gave more than a breath of relief. One had just not to think of it, take the days as they came, for there would be no change until God sent warmth into the air again. And Eirik discerned where the true sacrifice and severity of the monastic life lay. That a man had to will it himself, and will it once and for all. Renounce playing with fortune, and choose a life from which the unexpected was barred, and where all was willed in advance. The submission of one's will was itself an act of will. But then he thought he must give up. That was more than he could do. At last he had to tell Father Einar how it was with him. The monk answered that a man's destiny must be thought to follow him even into the convent. Or, to speak more justly, God might send him much that was unlooked for, sickness or journeys abroad, for example. Eirik must pray for strength to overcome this temptation. And Eirik prayed. But he knew himself that from deep within him, below the place in which he found the words of his prayer, a voice was pleading. "Don't show me this grace for which I pray. Send me home." At times he thought perhaps it was just in this that the devil showed his profoundest cunning, in never tempting him with anything that pertained to the profligate life of his young days. He hated the thought of it, and hated his old self. Even if he had to return to the world, at any rate he could never be like that again. It was the memory of Hestviken that broke through and overwhelmed him, as he lay at night remembering with all his body and all his senses. No place in the world had just the same smell as their own beach. Their corn, when it stood in stooks and when there had been a frost at night, was different from the corn of other fields. As he lay, he thought he could catch the scent of their own haycocks and of the limes on the cliffs around the bay. Behind his closed eyelids floated visions of the land from which he had cut himself off. The sedgy paths up in Ferndale, the little dry mound where he found Lapp arrowheads, every crack in the rocks at home, the black wall of the horse behind the houses, and the reddish rounded side of the bull rising from the sea, the surf at its foot, fresh and white on blue sunny days. But on autumn evenings it sent out a lowing in the darkness, and through the night one could glimpse the dancing breakers and flying white foam. Most of the calves that were born at Hestviken were brindled, and usually had white markings, a heart on the forehead, or patches of white on the sides, or white feet. He remembered the look of them as they grazed on the salt pasture of the great level meadow by the shore at Saltviken, and on the slopes where the wood had been cut down for burning charcoal. But the great junipers were left, dark and bushy. The salt pans he remembered, and the homestead a little way inland, with its houses falling into ruin. Only one was kept in repair so that the salt boilers and mowers might sleep in it. His father left the farm to hay and pasture, but Eirik himself had always thought that when his time came, he would take it up again. It might be much better for corn than the head manor at Hestviken. And this that called and allured his very body and blood, this was no sin. This too was an honourable and Christian life. Generation after generation of men had lived at Hestviken who showed God reverence and obeyed his commandments. Their hand had been open to the poor and to strangers. They had had both the power and the will to defend widows and the rights of lesser men, had been the first to fly to arms when the peace of the countryside was threatened by enemies from within or without the realm. If it fell to Jorund Reaper to possess the manor after his father, then much would be changed from the old ways. He knew his brother-in-law well enough for that. And what of himself, who all his life had had but one thought, of when one day he should be Master of Hestviken? Nor did he seem to be able to make any progress with his reading and writing now. Besides, he was now not the only novice under Brother Hubert. Early in the autumn, the son of a poor cotar from Ica had taken the habit. Much then had to be repeated, which Eirik had already learnt, and the new lessons dragged, for this brother Torbjorn was very dull of apprehension. Little by little the novice master, Brother Einar, began to lose faith in Eirik Olafsson's calling for the cloister. He had grown fond of the young man, not doubting that it was God himself who had roused him and brought him from thoughtlessness to reflection. Eirik's early fervour, his zeal to submit himself to the rule of the order, this had been far more than a whim. But now, in the first place, there was the fact that he had been driven to the convent gate by grief over a woman, even though there were much else beside. But it was the experience of the novice master that those who surrendered their love to God because they had been disappointed of their desires in this world seldom made the best monks. And what had been the actual relation between Eirik and this foster sister of his, he could not tell. Now the man said that nothing sinful had taken place, and he was afraid it was the devil who had tempted him to think it worse than it was, in order to frighten him into the convent without a true calling for it, in which case he would be a bad monk and a sure prey of the evil one. Brother Einar had indeed corrected him severely for speaking thus. The devil has no more power of a man than God permits and the man himself gives him. and he cannot rob God's household of its servants unless they themselves open the door to him. But there was something in what Eirik said. The novice master perceived that Eirik was never wittingly untruthful, but it was clear that the man himself did not remember the real circumstances of the case, and he had seen the same many times before. Eirik had difficulty in remembering anything in such a way that he could tell the story of it twice alike. And if this was a fault in men of any condition, it was a grave fault in a monk. And Eirik was of a variable disposition, and no doubt would always be so. Brother Einar had seen enough, and more than enough, of such natures, and it was ever a misfortune for a convent to admit a brother who always longed for change, always desired for himself another office, or other work than that to which he had been assigned, or yearned to be removed to another house, until he had tried all the convents of his order in 3 or 4 realms. Had not Brother Edvin Richardson been a sore trial to the fraternity, pious and pure-hearted man as he was, with the spirit of unrest that dwelt within him? In his case, indeed, there was a sort of remedy for his roving disposition. He had such fame as a painter of images that he was sent for from all parts, where folk would have him come and work for them. But a restless spirit such as his was likely to infect a whole convent. Brother Einar himself had been a black friar among the Benedictines of Bjorgvin for 10 years before he received a call to join a stricter order, and he had now been a Minorite friar for more than 30 winters. But still he held that without weighty reason a monk ought not to abandon the convent where he first took the vow. With the spring, Eirik's affection for his convent was revived, but at the same time his longing for Hestviken grew stronger, and now he was utterly unhappy, for no path seemed open to him, and however much he prayed and disciplined himself, he was still torn in 2 directions by his longing. When, therefore, his trial was at an end, it was so ordered that he was to delay his profession until the autumn, when the other 2 novices, Brother Arne and Brother Torbjorn, would take the vow. Then it was that he forgot himself and struck that peasant of Beat to the ground. Had it been himself that this loon affronted, he believed he could have borne it now. But it was the house that he loved even more fervently, now that he had half decided to leave it, and the brethren of whom he was fond, and the habit of the order which he had striven to wear honourably and well. He humbled himself before the man at the first word from Brother Stefan. He humbled himself at home in the chapter house. But nevertheless it was this that finally turned the scale. But on the day when all the brethren went to Brother Bjarnbard the barber to have their crowns shaved, and he was not to go with them, that gave him a pang. And the morning when he was once more dressed in hose and shoes, with the red and yellow jerkin far too tight for him, and the belt and knife about his waist, he broke down altogether. He wept as he knelt in church, wept for shame and remorse, wished he had chosen to remain. But he knew in himself that now he would have regretted it, whichever choice he had made. The brethren took an affectionate leave of him, promising him their prayers, for he would still belong to their fellowship as a brother ab extra. Then he walked down toward the quay, feeling naked and ashamed in his unwanted dress, and shrinking from the eyes of everyone in the armourer's yard. And his heart was ready to break with grief as he set sail and steered out among the islands, alone in the little boat that Galfred had lent him. But when he had passed through the Haoi Sound and come far enough to see the familiar places along the shore, no, then he had no more regrets. And when he saw the white surf at the foot of the Bull, as he rounded the promontory and stood inshore, no, he had no more regrets. And as he walked up from the waterside, bare and empty-handed, the sea breeze sporting before him, making the corn of the good acre sway like flames, with the sun gleaming on its silky beards, Eirik felt inclined to leap the fence and stroke the barley that the wind was lashing. His father's coldness did him more good than harm. It cost him an effort to go about his daily life here at home in such different guise from his former self, but that he was not suffered without a struggle to live as he deemed to be right and worthy of a Christian man, that reassured him. He had chosen aright. He had not fled from the convent to return to his old thoughtless and idle life. There was yet a third way, and he had found it. It put fresh heart into him every day to feel that it was not always easy to follow it. So the winter went by without Eirik's showing the least sign of lukewarmness. About a week before Easter, Olaf and Eirik went together up to Galilee. Late in the afternoon, when the matters he had come about were settled, and Olaf sat at a table drinking with the sheriff and some others of the elder franklins, there was a noise in the courtyard. The door burst open, and a boy called to the men within that Eirik Olafsson lay outside and had surely gotten his death hurt. Olaf sprang up and ran out. Over by the stable a group of men stood surrounding one who lay on his side in the snow, which was red with his blood. His right hand still grasped his dagger. Eirik lay in a swoon. Olaf and another man carried him in and laid him on a bed, attended to his wounds. He had been stabbed with a knife in the back and again in front near the collarbone. His face bore marks of blows. They were ugly wounds, but need not be fatal unless the mischief was in it. While his father was tending him, Eirik opened his eyes. "Could you not curb your manhood no longer?" asked Olaf, but not unkindly. He was smiling a little. Eirik's eyelids dropped again. Olaf then heard how this had come about. It was two housecarls who had fallen out as they were saddling the horses. They seemed to have been old enemies, and it had come to blows. Their arms had been left indoors since the sitting of the court, so they took to their knives. When Eirik had tried to come between them, they had both turned on him, and then he drew his dagger, but only to defend himself. Neither of the housecarls had received more than a few scratches. Now they lay bound in a cellar. Eirik came to his senses for a while early in the night. He whispered that if this proved his bane, he did not wish a charge to be made against the poor men, but he forgave them as he hoped God would forgive him. To this Olaf made no answer. Neither he nor Rydolf meant to spare the men, if Eirik's wounds should take a bad turn. But all went well. Rydolf had sent for an old man who could staunch blood and was a good leech. A week later Olaf was able to move his son to Hestviken, and there he himself and Ragnar tended the wounded man so well that Eirik was on his feet again before Whitsunday. After this, peace was re-established between father and son. But while he lay sick, Eirik had dropped out of the way of saying his hours and all his other practices. On getting up he did indeed resume them, but either kept them less strictly than before, or concealed them better from his housemates. And if Olaf came upon him while he said his paternosters, or noticed that Eirik imposed on himself any kind of self-discipline, his son was sure to hear of it later in the day. "It is a good thing, Eirik," his father said with a quiet laugh, "that we have seen your hand still knows its way to your dagger. Else it would not be well for the rest of us to dwell under the same roof with so pious a man as you have grown." Eirik turned red. It hurt him that his father should talk in this way. But Olaf said it so good-humouredly, and Eirik had never been able to resist his father when he showed him the smallest speck of kindness.